coal in the boot. This meant that the system was much simpler in control terms than that of Lotus, because it kept springs and dampers for ride control, absorbing the bumps, and just used the suspension to keep the aerodynamic platform as level as possible. Even so, Williams had, thus far, made a bit of a hash of active suspension, and ended up taking it off the car after false starts in 1986 and again in 1988. Part of the problem with these earlier efforts had been poor electronic control. So, Patrick had acquired two bright young engineers, Steve Wise to design an in-house manufactured electronic control unit with combined data recording capability, and Paddy Lowe to write the control algorithms. They had done their work to the point that they needed a car to go testing with by autumn 1991, so my contribution to the project was to work out how to install the active struts, spring canisters and so forth on the existing FW14A chassis. My slightly inelegant looking solution was to throw away the front and rear rockers that normally serve to take the load from the suspension push rods to the spring damper units, and instead fit the actuators directly on the ends of the push rods. At the front, this gave rise to bulbous pods on each side of the chassis, meaning that the active car, christened FW14B, is easily distinguished from the passive 14A. The hydraulic layout was the same as the Williams engineers had used in 1988. It ran the risk of compromise to both ride and response to steering inputs, because we were still mixing the platform control with the ride control system, but we felt the aerodynamic gains from the platform control should easily make up the deficit. During testing in the autumn of 1991, we concentrated on using our test drivers, Damon Hill and Mark Blundell, to do the initial debugging and development work. Once the season finished, we involved Nigel and Ricardo in testing the car. That's where we hit a snag. Both reported that it felt rather uncommunicative and didn't give them much feedback in the first entry part of the corner. They almost had to trust it had the grip rather than knowing. In addition, Nigel was worried about the safety of the system. He had been at Lotus when they developed their system and had encountered hydraulic failures that dumped the car on the ground, turning it into a high-speed sledge that could easily be heading straight for the barrier. He was so worried, in fact, that he requested a meeting, folding his arms and telling me and Patrick, "I don't want to race this car. I want to race a passive car." At this juncture, I should point out that I had been hard at work on a new car, the FW15. The car was designed to be an active car. The mechanical package was rearranged to carry the active components more elegantly, while the aerodynamics had been developed to work over the much narrower ride height band that active suspension allows, meaning that they would probably work poorly over the wide range of passive car. The research on the car had started late, because we did not want to commit to this route until we were confident that autumn testing showed everything to be working well. Consequently, the FW15A was to be introduced for the start of the European season in May, with the FW14B carrying us through the first flyaway intercontinental races. To deviate from the plan now, December 1991, and stay with passive suspension would have meant restricting ourselves to the FW14A for the bulk of the 1992 season. Given that McLaren had outdeveloped us at the tail end of 1991, it seemed highly unlikely that we would be able to mount a credible championship campaign with such a strategy. So, my response to Nigel's plea was, "Nigel, the new car's designed around it being active. It won't work well as a passive car. To revert now to passive is dooming ourselves to not winning the championship. We have to commit to active, get it to work, and get it reliable." Patrick agreed. Nigel was overruled. If a driver feels at risk, you've got to listen. It was our job as engineers to make sure the car was safe. It's all about trust, and trust is a two-way street. Winter is always an uneasy period. As a team, it is just as intense as during the season, because we will be busy completing the design of the following season's Challenger. From wind tunnel tests and simulation programs coupled with dyno results from our engine partner, Renault, we will have a good idea of how much faster we expect the new car to be, but we have no idea whether other teams have found more speed. Pre-season testing, after everybody has launched their new car and started to converge for common tests, usually at Barcelona, is where each team starts to get a broad idea of how competitive they are relative to their rivals. At these tests in February, it became apparent that our rivals had not made a big step forward over the winter, whereas with the 14B, we had. Indeed, we appeared to have such a big competitive margin that our problem was not, will it be quick enough? The problem was, will it be reliable? In May 1992, Marigold and I moved into the old vicarage next to the church, a bigger house than my little cottage in Marsh Gibbon or Marigold's lodge house in Stowe, and one that had a really nice feel to it. In August, we were married. Hannah and Charlotte were bridesmaids, although Charlotte had a broken arm in plaster, so it was covered in material matching the dress. I've found that personal life and work life seem to echo each other. If one goes sour, the other goes sour, and if one's going well, the other goes well. So it had proved. Chapter 36. The first race of the 1992 season was South Africa, Kyalami, and we set off convinced we had the performance to win, but freighted with concerns that our car was unreliable. Fresh in our minds were a couple of scares that pre-season testing had thrown up, so there was much chewing of fingernails and biting of lips. But the weekend was a dream, an absolute dream. We qualified on pole by a huge amount, locked out the front row, and then dominated the race. First and second, no problems at all as far as the active suspension was concerned. The one thing I did do from a control point of view was suggest cockpit adjusters, so drivers could fine-tune the system on the go. To that end, we installed 3 knobs in the cockpit. One for the target front ride height you're trying to achieve in a low-speed corner, another for high-speed front ride height, and a single knob for the rear ride height. This allowed the drivers to tune the balance of the car on the move. Important, as their normal in-cockpit tuning devices, the adjustable front and rear anti-roll bar levers, were deleted as a result of the system layout. The other thing I noticed from the wind tunnel results was that at very low ride height, the resulting stall of the diffuser reduced the drag of the car, due to reduction of what is known as induced drag, which is proportional to the lift or downforce of the vehicle. So we added a button to the steering wheel which, when pressed and held down, dropped the rear ride height. The drivers used this in areas where they were power rather than grip limited, generally in the straights, but also in Nigel's case for very fast corners, such as Blanchimont at Spa, where with sufficient courage the car could still be held flat with no lift of the throttle, even with a reduction of rear downforce. Effectively, it was an early version of DRS. After Kyalami, it was all about continuing to focus on reliability, so we decided to postpone the planned introduction of the FW15 for the European season and concentrate on making the FW14B as reliable as we could. From a racing aspect, that was how we spent the remainder of 1992, making sure the car finished. And it generally did, with not a single active suspension related DNF. We messed up Montreal with the wrong setup, but most of the races were easy victories. Simply put, we dominated. Despite his initial reservations, the car was made for Nigel. He had tremendous confidence in his car control and could cope with the fact that it moved around a bit on corner entry before the active system caught up with the transient demand of the steering input, because he knew the grip was there. He just had to ignore what he called the funny sensations it gave him, and trust that the more speed he carried into the corner, the more downforce and thus more grip he'd have. In the end, actually very quickly, Nigel was able to develop trust in the car and his ability to control it. Riccardo, on the other hand, never quite got there. He would turn into the corner, have this funny floating feeling and either back off or delay getting on the throttle until he felt it settle. Then, because that experience had failed to inspire any confidence in him, he wouldn't attempt to go any faster at the same corner on the next lap. Whereas Nigel thought, right, I got through fine on that lap, next lap I'll try a bit quicker. The other advantage Nigel had over Riccardo was his tremendous upper body strength. With extra downforce comes heavier steering, and the 1992 car did not have power steering. In a fast corner, if the driver is marginal in terms of his strength relative to the steering weight, he will often have to choose his steering position and then almost lock his arms in that position. If the car subsequently steps out at the rear end, he can correct it, because correction involves a reduction in steering load, but he will struggle to reapply the lock, and often runs out of road at the corner exit. Confidence sapping at the very least. For a driver, it's all about confidence. Nigel knew that if the car did something unexpected, he'd sort it out, whereas Riccardo didn't have that same level of confidence, at least not with that particular car. What also helped to destroy Riccardo that season were Nigel's little wind-ups. For example, at the start of the season, the FIA announced that they would be weighing drivers. In contrast to Riccardo, who trained hard, Nigel never took exercise or diet seriously. Case in point, when we were testing at Paul Ricard, we all went out to a swanky fish restaurant, and Nigel asked for ketchup to go with his sole. The waiter cast him a sideways look. "Ah, monsieur, you're so funny." "Well, thank you very much," said Nigel. And then, as the waiter turned to go, he added, "Where's my tomato ketchup?" "Monsieur, seriously?" "Yeah, seriously." The waiter span on his heel and stormed into the kitchen. It was like the Monty Python sketch. All we heard from the kitchen were indignant Gallic voices. The kitchen door swung open, and the chef marched out, bearing a huge catering-sized bottle of tomato ketchup, which he upended over Nigel's plate, dousing the soul in ketchup, a red-faced look of total disdain on his face. "Thank you very much," beamed Nigel in his usual brummy drawl. And that was pretty much his attitude to diet, in a ketchup-drenched nutshell. As a result, he knew full well that Ricciardo would beat him when it came to the weigh-in, especially as Ricciardo had been working particularly hard in the gym all winter. It's worth noting at this point that if the competition in Formula One is fierce, nowhere is it fiercer than between two teammates. With both of them driving the same car, it's the only contest on the grid that comes down to pure driving skill, and never was that more pronounced than between Nigel and Ricciardo in 1992. Coming out of pre-season, both were aware that we had a very competitive car, with a good chance, therefore, that one of them would be world champion. So, to score an immediate psychological win over Ricciardo, Nigel was determined to come in lighter. He stripped all the lining from a spare helmet, and then from his shoes. He dehydrated and starved himself for a day, and, come the weigh-in, he was about half a kilogram lighter than Ricciardo. It's funny how drivers get inside each other's heads. That really blew Ricciardo's mind. He was so proud of the fact that he'd lost weight over the winter and was super fit. To be beaten by burger-chomping Nigel was a huge psychological blow. Nigel had another tactic that didn't become apparent until later. Then and now, all teams stage a post-session race debrief, involving both drivers and all the engineers. The drivers talk about how the car has handled. Race engineers will report back on the setup of the car. This gives feedback to the team concerning how the car is handling and what setups best suit the car. Valuable information that is used to develop the car further. Except, what Nigel and his race engineer David Brown did was have two debriefs. In the official one, Nigel would say whatever he thought would send Ricciardo's team in the wrong direction. And then, later, he and David would have the real debrief. Same with his ride height knobs. Their positions weren't recorded in the data recorder, so when Nigel finished a run and came into the pit lane, he'd change them. Now, if one driver within the team is quicker than the other, it is common practice for the slower side of the garage simply to adopt the same setup as the quicker car. Since Ricciardo was often the slower one, he and his engineer would adopt Nigel's ride height settings, except, of course, they were incorrect. Because we had such a performance advantage, you could argue it was acceptable. But it caught Nigel out at Montreal, where he ran the ride height too low, making the car unstable in the bumpy braking areas, the danger of running solo and hence excluding the expertise of the rest of the team. The other funny incident was at Monza. "Nigel, how is it you're so much quicker than Ricciardo through the chicane?" Patrick demanded. "Well, it's very easy, really," grinned Nigel. "What I do is, as I'm approaching the curb, I jam my hands against the rim of the chassis, so the steering wheel can't kick back, and that keeps a much more consistent line." Armed with this information, Patrick went to Ricciardo's garage. "Ricciardo, what you need to do to keep a better, tighter line through the chicane is jam your knuckles against the cockpit." Willing to try anything, Ricciardo duly gave it a go, only to return 3 laps later with blood oozing through the knuckles of his gloves, where he'd skinned them on the cockpit. Just another of Nigel's wind-ups. It was his dry, brummy drawl that was Nigel's secret weapon. He had such a deadpan way about him. If he was in the lead, he'd start singing nursery rhymes over the radio. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, just amusing himself. On one occasion, he was ahead, singing his nursery rhymes to himself, when suddenly he went quiet. Finally, the radio crackled back into life. "I'm going to lose." "Why?" "The mirror's fallen off. That's a really bad omen, a broken mirror." He was very superstitious like that. I'm glad to say it was misfounded. He went on to win. Silverstone, our home race, was especially sweet for the second year in a row, with Nigel enjoying a 50-second lead at the end over third-placed Martin Brundle and Ricciardo taking the runner-up spot. In truth, it must have been a pretty boring race to watch, but the partisan crowd of "Our Nige" supporters were ecstatic, with hundreds of them clambering over the barriers to invade the track. Nigel was forced to stop and abandon the car on his slowing down lap, having run over a spectator at very low speed. We had a letter the next day from said spectator saying that he had broken his foot in the tumble, but felt that he was very privileged to suffer such an injury from Nigel. Monaco was painful. Nigel qualified on pole and dominated the race until about 10 laps from the end, when one of the rear wheels came loose. He pitted and the wheel was replaced, but the length of the stop gave Senna a narrow lead as Nigel re-emerged. Nigel was probably 3 seconds faster than Senna, but despite some flamboyant driving, making his car look big in Senna's mirror, Senna was far too wise and kept his McLaren tidy to win. During the post-mortem, we discovered why the wheel nut had come loose. A mechanic had trapped one of the cords that keep the tyre blanket in place between the wheel and the hub. When they gunned the wheel nut on, it had sliced the cord, but the remnants of the cord were stuck between the wheel and the axle. Over the course of the race, the cord had slowly worn away, the wheel nut had come loose, and that was that. There are so many silly little things that can trip you up. Unfortunately, this was a classic example. Massive shame. In my 6 seasons at Williams, we didn't win Monaco once. Ultimately, the championship is the prize, but, as I've said, Monaco is the prestige event. It's the most glamorous, it has the highest TV figures, it's the one all the sponsors attend, and it always eluded us. Otherwise, we dominated the season, with Nigel securing the Drivers' Championship in Hungary and us the Constructors in Belgium. It felt very, very good indeed. I didn't then, and still don't, think of it as glory, but no doubt about it, knowing you're performing at a world-class level in the most prestigious engineering-based sport, to come away with victory, or even better of course, the championship, is very satisfying. Tight championship battles are extremely stressful and exhausting, but this one was not one of those. It gave me a very warm glow inside. Even now, it's funny how early success always stands out. I clearly remember walking through the airport in Mexico after that first win with Ricardo. I put that achievement right up there with my children being born. That's a bit naughty of me, I suppose, but in my defense, it was something my whole life had been leading up to. From the kid sketching on bits of paper, making models, right up to becoming the person responsible for the design of a racing car that's won a Formula One championship. I remember thinking, this is one of the best days of my life. Chapter 37. For me, racing has been all-consuming, and there are times when it's been all I've thought about day and night. Frank Williams once commented that I am the most competitive person he knew. That competitiveness crept up on me in my early career. I wasn't that way in my youth, and certainly not in sport. But perhaps the dismissive attitude from school teachers and the struggle to get through university gave me a determination to prove I can succeed. Put that determination into the sporting arena, and it becomes competitiveness. Marigold said I was the most selfish person she knew. 2 failed marriages, the one to her included, suggest she may have a point. It's true that you can become so immersed in what you're trying to achieve as a competitor that you risk tunnel vision, becoming thoughtless as a result, and failing to consider the little things that make the people in your life happy and family life smoother. Even so, I prefer to think of myself as absorbed rather than selfish. After all, I'm not thinking about myself, I'm thinking about product. Issues of focus and absorption were very much uppermost in our minds at the end of the 1992 season, when, much to the surprise of the watching world, Williams and Nigel Mansell parted company. What emerged was that during the 1991 season, Frank had decided to try and woo a driver of greater perceived standing than Nigel, held secret talks with Alain Prost, and, with the seats for 1992 already contracted, signed a contract with him to drive for Williams in 1993. It was a questionable decision, made even more so in light of the fact that Nigel had then gone on to win the Drivers' Championship. To be fair to Frank, he was doing his thinking in 1991, when he had no idea that Nigel would be so well suited to the active car, or that he was about to reach a late peak as a driver. It's easy to look back now and wince at the idea of that change, because apparently one of Alain's contractual conditions was that he would not accept Nigel as his teammate. They had been teammates at Ferrari in 1990 and had not enjoyed the best of relationships, to put it mildly. So, Alain it was. If it had been him and Nigel in 1993, that would have been a hell of a battle. The British press were in uproar. Nigel was the working-class boy made good in a sport that can often, and unfortunately increasingly, be accused of being elitist, with only the children of wealthy fathers succeeding. The tabloids idolized him. Il Leone, they called him, a title he had gained from the Italian paparazzi during his Ferrari days. The Sun launched a Save Our Nige campaign, and we had protesters with placards outside the Williams factory for about a week, waiting to vent their fury when Frank was driven in. I think the best riposte was from somebody who posted a set of marbles in an envelope with an accompanying note, "For Frank, as he has clearly lost his." So, we now had Alain coming out of retirement, a great driver who had won 2 championships already, but a bit of a gamble, because when a driver comes back, you never quite know what you're going to get. For example, Niki Lauda came back after a retirement to win the championship again. He still had that focus. On the other, Michael Schumacher returned, but never looked the driver he had been prior to his retirement. Alain had gained the nickname The Professor for his very analytical approach to the sport, particularly his attention to detail in achieving a setup that suited his ultra-smooth driving style. He was the opposite of the swashbuckling image of a racing driver, always very reserved and thoughtful, but quite nervy, often worrying at his fingernails, which were always bitten down to the quick. Unlike Nigel, who used to bully the car, you never saw Alain's car slide or step out of line. His progress seemed almost stately. You could be forgiven for thinking he was slow until you looked at the stopwatch to see that he'd recorded yet another great time. History tells us that he hadn't lost any of that focus, which became evident at the first race. In the meantime, came a debate over who should take second seat. There was a camp led by Frank calling for the continuity of Ricciardo, whereas another lot, led by the engineers, including myself, thought that Ricciardo, while clearly a great competitor, was rarely on Nigel's pace and wouldn't challenge Alain. We proposed an alternative, Damon Hill. As well as driving for Brabham, Damon had been testing for us, was quick, and had given us feedback that was invaluable in developing the active suspension for the 1992 car. He knew it inside out. The downside again lay in doubts about his mental readiness. Throughout 1992, Damon had been racing in an uncompetitive car, often failing to qualify, which meant that he lacked race experience and therefore was something of a gamble, the opposite to Ricciardo, who was a very experienced driver but now, in truth, past his peak. Meanwhile, with the active car being so dominant, our rivals realized they had to get their own versions to work. So, McLaren, Ferrari and Benetton all launched their cars with active suspension for the start of the 1993 season. As it turned out, McLaren's system, while neat, was somewhat hobbled by their lack of power, as was Benetton's, while Ferrari couldn't get their system to work at all, so they weren't a threat. Meanwhile, we had been working on the FW15, the car we had been intending to race from the start of the European season in 1992. Eventually, we had started testing the car in the autumn of 1992, Damon helping in the development work. The upside of this was that by the start of the 1993 season, it had racked up a lot of test mileage, always very useful when it comes to trying to get reliability out of the car. The downside was that it was a 9-month-old design, in contrast to its new rivals. The car had evolved over that time, though. Rule changes to slow the cars down had been introduced, with a reduction to both overall car width and rear tyre width. Also, in reaction to our elaborate front wing end plate with skirts on the underneath, the FIA had introduced regulations that limited the end plates to a simple shape. Little did we know it at the time, but this was one of the first examples of what has, in my opinion, become a creeping regulatory disease in our sport. Ever more regulations that prescribe in great detail exactly where you cannot have bodywork, where you must have bodywork, even in some areas exactly what shape it must be. A soapbox subject I'll return to later. The rule changes meant mechanical and aerodynamic changes and development to suit. In addition, we developed electronically controlled power steering, electronically controlled power-assisted braking, and a 4-channel ABS system. All of the above essentially used the same technology as the active suspension, different from road car systems of the day. Power for the assistance came from a high-pressure hydraulic pump, a pump normally used on helicopters, with control from the onboard computer to what is known as a proportional valve, or Moog valve. Moog having a virtual monopoly in the aircraft and helicopter industry in this area. The power steering, in particular, was essential for Alain, who lacked Nigel's upper body strength and thus needed the extra assistance to cope with the heavy steering created by the massive downforce. So, yes, despite a few hiccups, particularly in wet races, we dominated the season and won. my second championship, with what is still probably the most technologically advanced car ever to race in Formula One. A rather sweet year. I wish I could say the same for 1994. Turn 5. How to build an FW16. Chapter 38. In 1993, Ayrton Senna was fed up. Having won the Drivers' Championship in 1991, he'd spent the next 2 seasons staring at the rear of a Williams. When Frank asked if he was interested in joining a team that had every intention of winning the next championship as well, who could blame him for wanting to make the switch? So it was that, arguably the world's best driver, signed for the reigning world champions. Suddenly, the question of whether to persuade Alain to stay for another year was moot. He and Ayrton were not the best of friends. Neither was prepared to drive with the other, and if it came down to a choice between Ayrton, who was driving at his peak, and Alain, who was brilliant but had probably crested, you'd choose Ayrton. Frank idolized him, and with good reason. Not only was he one of the all-time special drivers, but he had a certain aura about him. And if that sounds a bit corny, fair enough, but I can only say it made perfect sense when you were with him. You felt as though you were with somebody special. How much of that was due to his reputation is impossible to quantify, but you felt it. Prior to him joining Williams, I'd never had a proper conversation with Ed. He had been our main rival in 1991, and the only credible challenger to Alain in 1993. Back to that competitiveness thing, he was our nemesis. To now have him on our side was going to be amazing. I clearly remember the first day he came to the Williams factory at Didcot in the autumn of 1993. I was introduced to him and instructed to give him a tour, so I showed him around the drawing office and the factory, introducing him to staff, all the time being impressed by his interest in detail, his inquisitiveness, and his obvious enthusiasm. I took him over to the wind tunnel to show him the model of the 1994 car, and he was straight into the minutiae, down on his hands and knees, looking under the diffuser, listening closely as I pointed out key features. He wasn't an engineer, but he wanted to absorb as much as he could about the design and philosophy of the car. He was of the now slightly old-school approach that the more one can understand technically about a car, the more it will help one understand how to drive and feed back on it to the engineers, which is such a key attribute for any driver. He had a boyish enthusiasm, a desire to learn. It was definitely one of the qualities that made him so great. Then, of course, there was his driving. As a driver, he seemed to be able to make the car do things others simply couldn't. He first got noticed in Formula One in 1983 during the turbo era, when he developed a very special driving technique in which he would be on the throttle and the brake at the same time. This was in the days before the flappy paddle, of course. You still had a conventional clutch pedal and gear lever. Ayrton's technique was to be on and off both throttle and brake throughout the corner in order to keep the turbo spooled up, so when he needed the power at the corner exit, the turbo was already producing the requisite boost. There was a theory that when the turbocharged engines were banned at the end of the 1988 season, he would lose his competitive advantage, because that driving technique wouldn't be relevant anymore. Of course, he proved them wrong, because another of his great talents was the ability to adapt his driving to suit the characteristics of the car. So, yes, that particular skill was taken away from him, but he had so many others up his sleeve it didn't matter. His car control and commitment was phenomenal. He had total self-belief in his own ability not to lose control of the car, and that allowed him to put it in places and in attitudes that other drivers wouldn't consider, because they felt it was too dangerous. To him, it wasn't a risk, since he had utter faith in his ability to control the car. What a driver! The thought of working with him was tremendously exciting. Chapter 39. At the end of 1993, Patrick Head and I were returning from testing the FW15 at Paul Ricard, see the prologue, on our way to Nice Airport in a hire car. I was driving, Patrick in the passenger seat, as we sped along the same twisting mountainous roads on which Frank Williams had had the accident that left him in a wheelchair. Frank had been running late, just as we were that evening, when he lost control of his hire car and rolled down the mountainside, the roof collapsing and fracturing his spine. We rounded a corner. About half a mile away, a car was coming in the opposite direction. Not a problem. There was room to pass. Except this guy was on the wrong side of the road. My initial reaction was to assume that as a foreign visitor, I was the one on the wrong side of the road, but I double-checked and no, I wasn't. He was. The closing speed was fast. Both cars were going quickly. Mine was an instinctive reaction. I did what most people would have done in that situation. I moved over to the other side of the road. The car, speeding towards us, did the same. Now I was the one on the wrong side of the road. And what flashed through my mind was that if we were all killed, the investigation would say I caused the accident by being on the wrong side of the road. The other thing that flashed through my mind was to cross back over to the correct side of the road. But then, if the car speeding towards us did the same thing, there would be no time to correct the error a third time. Thankfully, there was a little extra width on my side, a gravelly path beside the road, so I pulled harder over to the left, not necessarily to avoid the guy, more to say I'm staying on this side. Thank God, he got the message, stayed put, and we passed each other safely. We drove on. The close shave was like an extra passenger in the car. After a brief moment of stunned silence, Patrick cleared his throat. That was a bit of good driving, Adrian, he croaked. Thank you, Patrick, I squeaked. Imogen was born on the 30th of August 1993. She proved to be the ideal baby. She rarely even cried. She slept on a sheepskin, so we'd always take one with us when we went out to a pub or party, where she would drift off quite happily through any noise. I remember we had a jukebox, a replica Wurlitzer, in the hall at Fifield, and she was absolutely fascinated by its changing colour lights and rising lights. She used to sit in her nappy holding her milk and watch it quite happily for half an hour or so, before she'd get bored and wander off. During Marigold's pregnancy, I took delivery of a 1938 Jaguar SS100 that I'd had rebuilt, having bought it in its stripped-down state in the States. A lovely car. My friend Dave McRobert had a model.
Navigate to Santa Cruz.
Something went wrong. Please try again.
Car. My friend Dave McRobert had a Model SS100 on his mantelpiece, and that may well be where the fascination first arose. It was renovated by an enthusiast named Terry Rowing. I'd approached Terry to ask if he would rebuild it in exchange for being allowed to copy the pattern for future replicas. He agreed, and 5 years later we had a finished car. All the replica SS100s you now see around are actually based on my car. It's something of a tradition to name my cars. Yes, there are a few. And I called this one Reginald, a family tradition inherited from my parents, always boys' names on the basis of reliability, one of my dad's little jokes. The day Terry delivered him, I took it for a spin around the Williams car park. On one particularly beautiful summer's day, I packed the children into Reginald and went for a drive. At the traffic lights, I turned to the girls, who were perched on a sort of luggage shelf in the back. "What do you think?" I grinned. Hannah looked excited. "It's wonderful, Dad. It's like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang." Charlotte was less impressed. "Is that the last one they had left at the garage, Daddy?" So many very happy memories. I had my family safe and well around me. Ayrton would be racing for us. Life was very, very good. Chapter 14. The FW16 could and should have been a great car for 1994. One of the tricks we had up our sleeve was launch control, a system aimed at improving start times. The driver dumps the clutch, and the electronic control system does the rest in terms of getting the car off the starting line as quickly as possible. Another trick, Patrick's baby, not mine, was what's called a CVT, a continuously variable transmission system. Those of us who are getting on a bit may remember a thing called a DAF Variomatic, a little fiberglass Dutch car with a small engine and, in place of a conventional gearbox, a belt and pulley system that shifted the gear ratio. What that meant was that the engine could sit at a near constant RPM, and all the speed control would be done not by the revs, but by changing the gear ratio. For a racing engine, that's a benefit. It meant that our engine designer, Renault, could optimize the engine performance for a single RPM, and then we would do the rest of the control by changing the ratio of the pulleys. True, as a gearbox, it's somewhat less efficient because of the greater friction associated with it, but from an engine point of view, being able to tune your inlet and exhaust lengths as well as your valve timing to a single RPM means you can generate a lot more power than you can for an engine that has to deliver power over a wide range of RPM. I have to say, it would have sounded hideous to spectators, and would probably have been bad news for the sport, because the sound of an engine lapping at near constant RPM is horrible compared to that generated by the gear changes and and rising and falling RPM that we're used to. I know from experience. We tested our CVT at Silverstone. Yes, it sounded horrible, but it's not our job to ensure that the car sounds nice or smells good or looks pretty. We're shark-like in our purity of purpose. We exist only to make the car go faster. The stopwatch is our master. In an alternative universe, perhaps, we used the CVT. The other teams cottoned on, and that beloved noise of Formula One, something that drew many of us to the sport in the first place, changed irrevocably, at least for a while. In reality, however, Ferrari heard of our plans and complained. Ferrari complaining was to become a recurring theme over the ensuing years. If Ferrari didn't like something, usually because they couldn't get it to work for themselves, they complained to the FIA. Whether or not they were assured of a sympathetic ear is up for debate. I'm sure Max and Bernie would strenuously deny Ferrari wherever showed favoritism. Suffice to say, however, that it was around this time that those in the pit lane began to refer to the FIA as Ferrari International Aid. It was years later, in 2015, that it emerged that Ferrari did indeed have a secret contact with the FIA that allowed them to veto any falling confirmation of a special relationship that we always suspected, but until then had never had confirmed. Ferrari didn't know exactly what we were up to, of course, but like us and every other team on the grid, they were working on various electronically controlled enhancements. In particular, they could not get active suspension to work, with Gerhard Berger being lucky to escape serious injury when their car dumped itself on the ground at the exit of the pit lane in Barcelona. But Max Mosley, it would appear, wanted both to help Ferrari and to slap down Williams' McLaren. So what he did was invoke Article 3.15. Article 3.15 first became a feature of the regulations sometime after 1968, which was when cars began sprouting those ungainly-looking aerodynamically adjustable wings mounted on huge struts at the top of the suspension uprights. The wings had caused a series of accidents. Cars were literally taking off. So the FIA introduced Article 3.15, which said, bodywork must be rigidly attached to the entirely sprung part of the car and must remain immobile in relation to the sprung parts of the car. Now, in my opinion, the must remain immobile part of this sentence was interpreted somewhat loosely, because what the FIA contended was that the pistons in our active suspension system were not remaining immobile relative to the sprung part of the car. But wait a minute, those pistons cannot be considered bodywork. No matter. It's our bat and ball, and we're telling you it's illegal. That was it. Out went our active suspension. Not just that, but what followed was a series of regulation changes that effectively outlawed everything that we and others had been developing as well. Out went CVT, traction control, launch control, servo-assisted braking, 4-channel ABS, rear-wheel steering, electronically controlled power steering. Technology was evil and had no place in Formula One, seemed the summary. It was also declared that the weight limit was now to be 575 kilograms, including the driver, meaning that a very light driver such as Alain would no longer have a built-in advantage. In-race refueling was to be reintroduced, something that had been banned at the end of 1984 over concerns it could lead to a major fire. There was no way of challenging these decisions. All you could do was stomp and sulk, go home and be irritable with the family, then go back to work and start again. Only this time, we were starting again behind our competitors. We were not as far down the electronic control route as them. All our eggs had been in the active suspension basket for 2 seasons. Why, you might ask, did Max take this course of action? My theory is twofold. First, because the British garages teams of Williams, McLaren and Tyrrell were beginning to ask questions regarding the ownership of FOCA and needed showing who was boss. Second, because Ferrari threatened to leave the sport, which is something they do every now and then. Rightly or wrongly, there's a feeling that the sport needs Ferrari, and that its credibility partly rests on their involvement. Ferrari hadn't won the World Championship since 1978, and I'm sure Bernie was of the opinion that a Ferrari World Championship would be good for viewing figures. More viewing means more TV money, and more TV money means more income to, well, Mr. B. Eccleston. Bernie had gone from leading the small British teams against the might of the grandees led by Ferrari to being desperate to keep them in the sport and ensure they were successful, and at the same time to teach the British teams a lesson. Anybody read Animal Farm? Chapter 41. The FW16 then was an evolution of the FW15. Just as I always have and always will, I worked on the basis that if you have a car, try to evolve that concept. Don't try to come up with a totally new one unless there is a very good reason. Once again, if you were to take the FW16 of 1994 and stand it alongside, you'd see strong similarities. The shape of the monocoque, the suspension layout, the shape of the side pods, the rear wing end plate, the philosophy behind the front wing and the front wing end plate, all of those evolved from the 881 principle. Had we become too complacent, conservative? Possibly. With the regulation change from active back to passive suspension, we should probably have made more changes in order to develop a car more aerodynamically suited to a large range of ride heights. You could probably argue that we didn't adapt to what was effectively a major regulation change, the banning of active suspension, as well as we could and should have done, and that I didn't put enough thought and work into this area. In the end, my main focus in designing the 1994 car was to try to tidy the flow to the beam wing, the lower of the two rear wings, as much as possible. The beam wing serves two purposes. One is to generate downforce in its own right, and the other, more powerful purpose, is to generate low pressure above the trailing edge of the diffuser, helping to draw flow through it. One of the things limiting how low you could mount the beam wing was dirty air coming off the rear top wishbone. One way to improve that was to move the top wishbone. So what I did was lower it about 120 millimeters to the point that it enclosed the drive shaft. In those days, suspension wishbones were made almost universally out of steel tubes welded together, but such a construction would not suit a shape that enclosed the drive shaft. So instead, we made it out of carbon fiber as a large monocoque construction that did not have traditional individual legs, the drive shaft passing down the center of its hollow core. It gave us much cleaner flow onto the mid and tip areas of the beam wing. The regulations called for a rain light, a square light about 100 by 100 millimeters. It's used in wet races when cars throw up a rooster tail of water behind the car. The rain light aims to cut through that ball of spray so that the following driver can at least see the light in the middle. Sometimes in really heavy weather even that rain light wasn't enough, but as LEDs have become more and more effective, they're now at the stage where they're powerful enough to do the job. Blinding actually if you stand close behind the car in the garage. The light usually sat beneath the beam wing. The trouble was that it damaged the flow where the beam wing should have been at its most efficient. The very bit of the wing you want to work best was destroyed by the presence of the rain light. Getting that wishbone out of the way allowed a much lower profile to the top of the gearbox, which in turn gave the space to put the rain light above the gearbox and forward of the rear axle center line. It was such a long way forward that it became part of the engine cover, faired in using a polycarbonate transparent cover. We made the wing anhedral shaped, so that it sat lower at its tips than on the car center line. So the flow across the wing was now very tidy on the center line, not disrupted by the rain light, and at the tips, not disrupted by the top wishbone. Mind you, the FIA didn't like the position of the rain light. They said you had to be directly behind the car to see it, otherwise it was obscured by the pylons that held the wing in place. In fairness to them, they were probably right, but it was within the letter of the regulations, so they couldn't do anything about it. Rules are rules. Pre-season testing commenced, and straight away it became apparent that we were going to have serious competition from Benetton, who, with Michael Schumacher driving, seemed to have produced a quick car. Adding to our concern were issues of our own. Ayrton didn't like the seating position, with the low-mounted, smallish diameter steering wheel, but it was far too late to be able to do much about it. Worse, once testing commenced, both he and Damon were finding the car unpredictable, particularly on an uneven surface. Thankfully, we had Damon in the cockpit, who had driven the 1993 car, and that was useful because it made us realize how much we'd lost through the ban on active suspension. It wasn't that we'd produced a bad car as such, it was that we hadn't produced a car that was well suited to passive suspension. We were casting anxious glances at Benetton. Their car seemed to be very competitive. It looked like they were going to be our prime rival. Concerned, we left for the first race in Brazil, home turf for Ayrton, who had recently celebrated his 34th birthday. He had just over a month to live. Chapter 42. Brazil is a colourful place bursting with enthusiasm and joy of life. But like some of the smaller and poorer countries in Africa, it's a country where you have pockets of extreme wealth amid huge numbers of very poor people, where life has little value. They are, of course, mad about Formula One in Brazil, and back then they were nuts about Ayrton Senna. This year, He was Team Williams, and no longer our nemesis. What a relief we didn't have to worry about a repeat of the previous year, when Ayrton was driving for McLaren, and there had been a chance of him winning the Grand Prix against Alain and Damon in the Williams. Driving into the circuit in our VW minibus the previous year had meant negotiating a gauntlet of Brazilian fans chanting, blowing horns and waving flags. Being an English team, we gulped and smiled wanly, pretending nothing was amiss as our bus inched through a sea of yellow to the circuit gates. Somebody in the crowd spotted our uniforms, our Williams uniforms, and pointed us out before starting to hurl abuse. We were the team most likely to prevent Ayrton from winning. It was viral. More abuse came our way. We gulped harder and smiled a little more wanly, painfully aware that a crowd can so easily become a mob. A surge of something passed through the fans, and the next thing we knew, something hit a window. Then they were rocking the bus, and one of them had even scrambled onto the roof and was jumping up and down. It went on for several hours. Well, it certainly felt like several hours, but may in fact have been only about 45 seconds before our bus reached the gates and police broke up the crowd with their batons. At least things would be safer this year, I told myself, arriving with Sheridan Finn, the head of marketing at Williams. We had Ayrton on our side. Sao Paulo was his hometown. We were late, and Sheridan and I flagged a taxi to get from Sao Paulo airport on the outskirts to the hotel. We settled back, hoping for the best as we drew out into the madness of the city morning rush hour. As we crawled along, it became apparent that our driver, possibly having had a heavy night, was nodding off, chin resting on his chest, the works. After about the fourth time of finding ourselves at a standstill and having to rouse him from his slumber, we decided to put a bit of fire in his belly by showing him our Williams travel shirts. "Ayrton Senna," we said, "Ayrton Senna," indicating onward, onward. It was one of those careful what you wish for moments. Our actions had the desired effect. Our driver was suddenly wide awake and making haste to our destination. The problem was that he began driving like a lunatic, weaving in and out of the traffic, heedless of the horns blaring around him, and oblivious to our abject terror as he attempted to prove that he too could drive like Ayrton Senna. We got there in one piece, thank God, but exited the car on legs of jelly. It was probably the most frightening drive of my whole life. The disconcertingly low value placed on life was illustrated not only by the Mercedes stand at the track, displaying the latest bulletproof glass or doors rather than the newest car, but also by an incident I witnessed as I was driving from the circuit to the hotel. A car swerved ahead, and then I saw what looked like a large dog lying in the road. Oh God, I thought, the dog's been killed. Only to realize as I drew closer that, though it was indeed a body, it was human, not canine. That's how they dispose of bodies in the favelas, apparently. Just dump them on the highway. So, to qualifying at Sao Paulo's Interlagos circuit, nestled in the shadow of high rises that stood like ramparts along the city skyline. Still having problems with the car, especially apparent on a bumpy circuit like Interlagos, Ayrton hung on, and thanks to his phenomenal control and ability, managed to put the car onto pole, his starting position very much a measure of his ability rather than of our car's superiority. Onto the race, and for the first 21 laps he led ahead of Schumacher, but when they both pitted, Schumacher came out ahead. On the pit wall, our eyes were glued to the monitors, hearts in mouths, as Ayrton stayed on Schumacher's tail, harrying him. He could take the lead. We knew he could. If anyone could do it, Ayrton could. But then, on lap 56, coming out of the final corner just behind Schumacher, Ayrton span and stalled, and that was it. With Ayrton out, there was no reason for the partisan home fans to stay, and I watched them empty out of the grandstand, their round-shouldered dejection matching our own. Schumacher came in first, Damon second. What a great, great shame it was. Even more so in retrospect, when you consider the pressure Ayrton must have been under that day. If he'd won, or at least been second, then perhaps he would have gone on to the next race, the Pacific Grand Prix, and the one after that, Imola, in a different and less intense frame of mind. Perhaps things would have been different. So many what-ifs and should-haves surrounding his death. So many factors that were individually insignificant, but collectively played their part. In the debrief afterwards, Ayrton congratulated Damon on finishing second, held up his hands and said the spin was his mistake and his alone. None of us had it in our hearts to pass judgment. He was driving a difficult car on the limit, and he'd done things with it no other driver could. Afterwards we were sitting in Sao Paulo airport lounge, waiting for the flight home, mostly in silence, the way you do when things haven't gone your way, when we received the news that Benetton might be excluded from the Brazilian result. That perked us up a little. The reason was to do with the barge boards on their car, the vertical curved boards that sit just in front of the side pod, their job being to deflect the front wheel wake outwards, diverting it away from the main bodywork and diffuser. One of the regulations states that all bodywork, viewed from underneath, must form a uniform, solid, hard, continuous, impervious surface. But the barge boards on the Benetton were mounted with one stay at the front and one at the rear, the combination forming a hole. That's why they were to be excluded, because of this hole. Clearly, a hole is not impervious. Ah, but Benetton said, no, actually, it's not a hole. It's a series of stays and a barge board. Which is a bit like saying that the bit in the middle of a polo mint isn't a hole, it's just a place where there happens to be no mint. It seemed a weak argument that wouldn't wash with the FIA. But it did wash with the FIA. The upshot was that Benetton weren't excluded, and the regulations were altered for 1995 to specifically allow holes in this area. The next race was a new one, the Pacific Grand Prix held at the Tanaka International Circuit, or IT Circuit, in Aida, Japan. I didn't go. I stayed behind at Williams. I wanted to work in the wind tunnel in a bid to understand why the car was behaving so badly. Instead, I watched on TV as Ayrton once more managed to put his car on pole, knowing that, again, it was down to his ability rather than the car. In the race, he crashed at the first corner. He was lightly bumped by Mika Hakkinen, and Span came to a rest in the sand track, and that was his race over at the first corner. Another tough result. All of which meant that by the end of the second race of the season, Ayrton hadn't finished at all, and Damon had a single second place. By any measure, it was a diabolical start to our year as reigning champs, and as frustrating for us as it was for Ayrton, who must have been cursing his flawed timing. He'd joined a hugely successful team, only to see them lose their competitive edge. He'd watched the rest of the race from the marshal's hut on the outside of turn 1, and I remember that he returned with his suspicions raised. There was something about the sound of the Benetton, Schumacher's Benetton, not his teammate, that sounded wrong to Ayrton. He was convinced they were using traction control. Still, I struggled to understand what was wrong with our own car. Clearly, it was an aerodynamic problem. Something was unstable in the aerodynamics, which meant it had to be related to the ground effect. The two things closest to the ground are the front wing and the floor, so it could be that the diffuser or the front wing was stalling. We tested at Circuit de Nogaro, a bumpy little circuit in southwestern France. Just a skeleton crew with Damon driving. It's jumping around so violently, he told me, I can't see. I sent him out again, but this time took a scooter to watch the car on the back straight. Just as he'd reported, it was pogoing up and down so much that the front wheels were virtually leaving the track. This at something like 150 miles an hour. No doubt in my mind, something was stalling. For it to be as violent as that, for the front wheels to be almost airborne, there had to be something very unstable about the aerodynamics. I remember driving back from Nogaro that night. Damon, in his hire car, lights off in stealth mode, was bumping me from behind. Little did I know that it was to be a long time before either of us felt like pulling such pranks again. Back to the wind tunnel I went, trying to understand it. With the wind tunnel modelled down to the lowest front ride height where stall and separation is more likely to occur, we used flow fizz, and it looked fine. Nothing in the wind tunnel to indicate the front wing was at fault. I moved on to the underside of the car, used flow fizz again, and this time discovered separation underneath the leading edge of the side pod. The separation was sufficient that the centre of the diffuser was almost completely stalled. This was a proper eureka moment. The issue was a simple geometrical problem requiring a simple geometrical solution. Basically, the side pod we had on the car was reasonably long, so the front edge of it was close to the front tyres. By making the side pod long, it has more area to it, so if you can manage to get the same amount of suction along that extra length, you've got more total downforce. But that extra length also brings it closer to the ground if the front is very low. The resulting constriction was causing very high local velocities in the flow, followed by rapid deceleration. This creates a highly adverse pressure gradient, and that causes separation, in this case a very violent and catastrophic stall. It explained what I had seen with my eyes on the straight at France. The bumps were setting up a pitch in the car that put the aerodynamics into an unstable area. The solution was to go to a much shorter side pod. It would mean less ultimate peak downforce, but the front of the floor would not get so close to the ground, the diffuser wouldn't stall, and we might be back in business. So in the period between the Pacific Grand Prix and Imola, I started designing a shorter side pod, which in the wind tunnel appeared to produce a more stable solution to take to production. It was not a massive change. The mechanical packaging of the car, the radiators and so forth could stay in the same place, but it still involved a sizable amount of work, because it meant a completely new floor and new bodywork. With that ongoing, we left for the San Marino GP in Imola, a bumpy circuit that we thought might be bad news for us. We had no idea. Chapter 43. It was sunny and hot at Imola for the San Marino Grand Prix. Not at all the kind of weather you associate with the dark events that unfolded right from the moment I arrived at the circuit on Friday morning. The pre-qualifying session was running as I walked in through the car park, and the sight that greeted me was that of a car coming out of the last corner before the final chicane. It wasn't on all four wheels. It was on its side, 20 feet in the air, rattling along the wire of the barrier above the wall before dropping down and out of sight again. Christ, I thought, I hope that guy's all right. It was the Brazilian, Rubens Barrichello, in a Jordan. Doing around 140 miles an hour, he'd hit a curb on the corner they call Variante Bassa hard enough to launch his car airborne, then into a roll before it came to rest upside down. Apparently his tongue, as a result of the accident, blocked his airway, and if not for the quick work of Sid Watkins at the trackside, he probably would have died. As it was, he was rushed to the medical centre, from where he was airlifted to the Maggiore Hospital in Bologna. Back at the circuit the following day, he was reduced to spectator status thanks to a broken nose and arm in plaster. He was okay. Indeed, Rubens currently holds the record for competing in the most Formula One races. Even so, it was one of those really nasty what-if crashes. The kind you witness and marvel how anybody could come out of it unhurt. The kind that gives you pause for thought. Just what are we doing, running such huge risks? I wonder if Ed thought so too. Later, I discovered that he'd been to check on Barrichello, his fellow countryman. Barrichello had recovered consciousness to find Ayrton in tears by his bed, so they say. With pre-qualifying over, practice started. Ayrton was quick, but as usual the car was difficult over bumps. It was bugging him, same way it bugged us all. We've since discovered that he'd recently had discussions about joining Ferrari, so I guess he had that in the back of his mind as well. There was also the fact that his family apparently disapproved of his new girlfriend, and his suspicion that Schumacher's Benetton was using traction control. That said, there's no doubt in my mind that his major preoccupation was the fact that he hadn't yet won a race. He wasn't one to apportion blame. If anything, he was too quick to take responsibility for things that weren't his fault. But this was his championship bid, and he was yet to score a single point. He knew we were trying to understand the car, and he listened patiently and understandingly as I explained to him what I'd seen at Nogaro, and how I thought that the problem was the side pods, explaining that we were designing new ones, that a solution was in hand. At the same time, we'd done what we could to address an ongoing issue he had with his seating position, where he felt cramped and was rubbing his knuckles on the inside of the cockpit. Why this was happening, I'm still not sure. His hand position on the wheel must have been different from that of his predecessors or teammates. Either way, he wanted the steering wheel lowered slightly to give more knuckle clearance. The job was to move the steering wheel down by a couple of millimeters, but we had to bear in mind an FIA regulation template, which was an aluminium plate with a width of 200 millimeters and height of 200 millimeters. Officials had to be able to pass it between the driver and the inside of the cockpit, from his upper body down to the pedals. If this wasn't possible, your car was declared illegal and excluded. If we lowered the steering column, then the template wouldn't pass. The solution was to reduce the diameter of the steering column locally by 4 millimeters, which is what we'd done. At the track, however, there was still this ride problem to address. More in hope than expectation, we fitted softer springs, but that just meant bigger changes in ride height, which in turn aggravated the aerodynamic instability. We tried running the front higher, but lost too much downforce. I still had hair then. I was raking my fingers through it, trying to find the answer, knowing in reality that the problem was more profound than anything we could tackle at the track. We were trapped with a bad car. No amount of setup tuning with springs, dampers or roll bars was ever going to overcome its aerodynamic instability. There was another incident that day, comparatively minor. The front wing had come off one of the Simtech cars. Driving for Simtek then were Roland Ratzenberger and David Brabham. I'm afraid I don't remember which of them it was who lost their wing that day. Simtek was run by a guy called Nick Worth, an aerodynamicist I knew from Leighton House. He was a bright chap, but he'd gained the nickname of White Noise because he wouldn't concentrate on one thing. He had a close relationship with Max Mosley, and the pair of them had set up Simtek to enter Formula One in 1994, making Worth a very young team owner. That evening in the paddock, I was approached by Charlie Mooney, team manager at Simtek, another old Leighton House face and also an old Reptonian, so someone I knew fairly well. "Adrian," he said somewhat sheepishly, "Nick's told me to fix this front wing. Can you give me some advice?" I looked at him, knowing he wasn't an engineer, and wondering how on earth he'd got roped into sorting out this problem. "Where's Nick?" I asked. "He's at a sponsor's dinner." "Well, look, Charlie, I'm sorry, I'd love to help you, but I don't know anything about the design of your car. I really don't know what to suggest. You need to get Nick back, he's the engineer." I watched Charlie leave, worried by our conversation. Saturday came, and in qualifying, Roland Ratzenberger, driving his Simtek, came off the track. He was competing for the final slot on the grid at the time, so instead of pitting to have the car checked over, he continued for another lap. On the straight, the front wing came off altogether, was dragged beneath his car, and stopped him cornering. He ploughed into the outside wall at just under 200 miles an hour. Sid Watkins, the chief medical officer, did his best. For the second time that weekend, a driver was airlifted from the Imola circuit to the Maggiore Hospital. Roland, sadly, was not as fortunate as Rubens. He was pronounced dead at the hospital. Chapter 44. Ayrton didn't have many close friends within the Formula One paddock, but Roland was one of them. He jumped into an official car to take him to the scene of the accident the moment he heard about it. Later, when Roland was pronounced dead, he wept on Sid Watkins' shoulder. The two were great friends, but when Sid asked Ayrton not to race the following day, "Give it up, let's go fishing," he'd said. Ayrton could only say that he had to race. He had to go on, no matter how shaken he was. He had to go on. Ayrton withdrew from qualifying, though his times were enough to put him on pole, which meant that for the third time in a row, it was Ayrton on pole with Schumacher second. There was much talk of how Roland's accident could have happened. The mood in the paddock was muted at best. Death in motor racing up until the 1970s had been all too common, but this was the first time a driver had died in a Formula One race since Gilles Villeneuve 12 years earlier. For many in the paddock, including myself, it was a new experience. We were in a state of shock. No doubt everyone felt the same way. Is it worth it? Is all this worth a man dying? On the day of the race, I was in the back of the truck, close to the time when the cars leave the pit lane for the grid, collecting together my notes and bits and pieces, when in rushed Ayrton, quickly peeling off his race suit and changing his Nomex underwear. He's cutting it fine, I thought. What we now know is that on that morning he'd been talking to Alain Prost about reopening the Grand Prix Drivers Association with the aim of improving safety. As he pulled his overalls back up, he reiterated what he'd already said in the wake of the Pacific Grand Prix, that he thought Benetton were using traction control. After that Pacific race, Ferrari also had to ride out a stink regarding their own possible use of traction control, with subsequent grumbles about favoritism reaching such a peak that, by Imola, Max was forced to issue a statement categorically stating that the FIA didn't love Ferrari any more or less than it loved other teams. It wasn't Ferrari traction control rumours that concerned Ayrton, though. It was his concern over Benetton, the feeling that he was battling an illegal driver-car combination. He went into that race with all that buzzing in his head, but he went in, above all, with a desire to win. Ayrton was one of the fiercest, most passionate competitors the sport has known. Chapter 45. The race began badly. Schumacher's teammate, JJ Leto, stalled the Benetton, and Pedro Lamy, his view-obscured, tail-ended him, sending debris everywhere, including into spectators, injuring a number of them. The carnage of the weekend seemed relentless. A fast left-hand corner shortly after the pits. It was typically taken flat out, although most drivers, including Damon, were taking a slightly wider line in order to avoid the bumpy inside section. Ayrton, it seems, wasn't doing that. He was taking the inside, a slightly shorter and, therefore, he felt, faster line, even though he knew the car was unstable over bumps. Again, he had that belief that he could control the car, whatever the situation. Meanwhile, of course, one of the effects of circulating slowly behind the safety car for 5 laps was that the tyres had cooled, tyre pressures fallen, and ride heights become lowered as a result. So when the race restarted, Ayrton's car was bottoming very heavily, by which I mean the underside of the car was making contact with the track. Much later, when we reviewed footage supplied to us from Schumacher's onboard camera, what we saw were showers of sparks from the back of Ayrton's car, particularly through Tamburello. First lap after the restart, lap 6, he made it through Tamburello, but with massive sparking, his car bottoming like crazy. He was ahead of Schumacher. All he needed to do was stop Schumacher from passing him, just as he'd done to Nigel at Suzuka in 1991. But Ayrton wasn't the type to settle back and keep one eye on the mirror. He was a racer, and that's what he did. His lap 6 was the 3rd fastest of the race, and that's with an almost full fuel tank and tyres at suboptimum pressure. The 7th lap was when the accident happened. By now you'd have expected tyre pressures to be normal, but going by Schumacher's onboard footage, Ayrton was bottoming even more, sparks spraying like Roman candles behind him as he took the inside line at Tamburello. What you see next on the onboard footage is the rear of Ayrton's car step out to the right. For a heartbeat, the car is pointing to the left, then suddenly it snaps right and disappears off in that direction, out of the camera's field of view. At the time, we were watching coverage on the pit wall, and what we saw was that there had been an accident involving Ayrton. A big accident. Damon, who had raced past the crash site, later said that it never occurred to him that the accident might be fatal, not until the red flags started waving. There on the pit wall, we were all on autopilot, as David Brown, Ayrton's race engineer, radioed him again and again, but got no response. I remember snippets. Ayrton sitting perfectly normally in the car, upright with his head against the headrest, but not moving. I can recall seeing Sid and the medical crew arrive. I remember seeing Ayrton being pulled out of the car, motionless, on a stretcher. All this on the monitors, of course. Over the radio, Damon was calling for information. What the hell's happened? How is he? What's happened? But we didn't know. The only information we had came from what we saw on the screens lining the pit wall. Our driver on a stretcher. No movement. No information. Another thing I remember, something burnt into my brain, is the noise from the spectators. The horns, klaxons and tambourines. All this excited frenzy of noise that carried on despite the terrible tragedy unfolding at Tamburello. The sound, a trademark of Italian Grand Prix, still to this day sends shivers down my spine. We don't know, Damon, I told him, as the cars were reformed on the grid. From over our heads came the sound of a helicopter. We just don't know. The race began again, and we were forced to refocus. The helicopter took Ayrton to hospital. Schumacher won, Damon finished 6th. The news came through at the airport. Ayrton was dead. Chapter 46. Frank's aircraft flew us back to Kidlington, north of Oxford. I don't think any of us spoke. I really can't recall. Only that Marigold met me at Kidlington and drove me home, knowing I'd be in no fit state to drive myself. She arranged for the local pub to deliver beer to the house so I could have a few drinks to unwind. It didn't work, but it was a nice thought. It was a warm evening, I can remember that, although it was only May. What I felt as I drank my beers and then lay awake in bed that night was an overwhelming sense of loss and, much more than that, waste. Even back then, you knew Ayrton was destined for great, even greater things. People had speculated that he might be president of Brazil one day. Was it all worth it? Just to watch a bunch of cars racing around a track on a Sunday afternoon? Even now, 20-something years later, I struggle to talk about it without my voice wavering. The next day was a bank holiday Monday. I went into Williams with other key engineers to see if we could understand what had happened. Was it a design fault that had caused the accident? Tamburello was difficult but flat, the kind of big balls corner that a driver should be able to take without lifting off the throttle. A driver of Ayrton's ability shouldn't have had a problem with a corner like that. We reviewed what footage we had, and it was clear that the steering wheel had come off. You could see the wheel and the end of the steering column lying beside the car in the TV footage. The obvious conclusion was that the steering column had snapped, and that was the cause of the accident. Patrick was technical director and therefore had technical charge of the team. I was chief designer and responsible for the overall design of the car. And though neither of us were involved in the design or manufacture of the actual components, as leaders of the ship, we had to assume responsibility. Put simply, if the steering column snapping was the cause of the accident, it was our fault, since we were responsible for putting in place the systems needed to avoid such a thing happening. It would take a long time before we identified the missing pieces of the jigsaw. I would spend the following months, as it turned out, years, having to watch the accident over and over again. The pictures from Schumacher's car, the circuit TV feed, the race footage, marrying it to the data, trying to understand what had happened, why Ayrton had died that afternoon. The FW60 had two onboard computers. One controlled the engine and was supplied by Magneti Marelli. The other was a Williams-built ECU that Steve Wise, the head of electronics at Williams, had developed to control the active suspension system in 1992. Computers had less of a function after the Great Regulations Purge outlawed our electronically controlled systems. However, they did provide some degree of data logging, namely using sensors around the car as a diagnostic feature, monitoring such things as loads on the suspension, the gear change, throttle position, engine RPM, wheel speeds, damper positions, areas that gave us information on what the car was doing around the lap. The Renault Marelli engine control unit had been largely destroyed in the accident, and the Williams control unit was badly damaged too, but we were able to extract some data from it. Importantly, what we were able to ascertain was throttle position, brake pressure, and steering torque, and what we saw appeared to substantiate the theory that it was a steering column failure, because it showed the steering column torque falling to near zero. In other words, there was no steering input during this phase. This could either mean that Ayrton had chose not to steer, or that he was unable to steer because the steering column had failed. Our feeling, however, that the steering column had been the main cause of the accident changed when the FIA provided us with the onboard footage from Schumacher's car. This indicated that the rear of Ayrton's car had stepped out, which was the opposite to what would happen if the steering column had failed. Obviously, if the steering fails, you expect the car to carry straight on. But if the rear of the car steps out, that can only be from a loss of rear grip, not from a loss of front grip. That seemed a bit peculiar. Coming from my oval racing experience in the States, I knew that drivers in superspeedway are often faced with this problem of the rear stepping out in high-speed corners. The usual method of trying to correct it is by applying opposite lock, i.e. in a left-hand turn, apply the lock to the right. But if the car is stepping out in a snappy and harsh manner, the fear is that the rear will suddenly grip and whip the driver around in the opposite direction, resulting in a nose-first crash into a wall. Superspeedway drivers will often let a spin take place rather than risk this happening. So, did Ayrton suffer that type of superspeedway accident, where the rear loses and then suddenly regains grip and flings him to the outside wall? It can happen to the most experienced and greatest of the superspeedway drivers in the States. Very quickly, the question became two-tiered. What caused Ayrton to leave the track in the first place, and given that he was such an able driver, why was he unable to control it? We were able to time-match Schumacher's onboard footage with the data from the onboard computer, and what we established was that at the moment the rear of the car stepped out, Ayrton lifted his foot to about 40% throttle, and the steering torque dropped. Now, if you suddenly lose rear grip, that is exactly the reaction you'd expect a driver to make. He doesn't lift his foot fully off the throttle. What he's doing at that point is trying to maximize the grip of the rear tires, which means trying to minimize the longitudinal force the rear tires are trying to transmit, be it acceleration or braking, so that they have the maximum capacity for lateral grip. It looked like that's what Ayrton had done. By reducing steering torque, he was effectively applying opposite lock, which, as I've said, is the usual way to correct the rear of a car that is stepping out. The data showed that Ayrton held that position of 40% throttle and low level of steering torque for half a second, then got very heavily on the brake. All we saw after that was extremely high brake pressure as he left the track. Again then, the sequence of events consistent with the data is that the rear stepped out. Ayrton reacted, doing his best to hold the slide by reducing to 40% throttle and reducing steering torque, before realizing after half a second that he'd lost control, after which he jumped on the brakes. The initial stepping out of the car was nothing to do with any steering column failure. There had to be another explanation for that. The safety car was an Opel Vectra, so the pace would have been very slow after the start-finish prang that showered the track with.
Navigate to Costco.
Getting directions to Costco Wholesale.
After the start-finish prang that showered the track with debris. After all those laps at such a slow pace, the tyres would have cooled, and tyre pressures been extremely low at the restart, and that, without doubt, would have aggravated the bottoming that we saw. But this doesn't fully explain everything. In fact, it may be a red herring. Why, for example, did Ayrton's car spark as much on lap 7 as it had on the previous lap, when tyre pressures should have become progressively higher? The suspension components themselves all seemed to be fine, so the obvious conclusion is that the tyres were still underinflated. But why? Their temperature and therefore pressure should have been back up to near normal after a full hard racing lap. There is a photograph in Autosport, 20th of February 1997, page 6, that shows a piece of debris on the track, with Ayrton's car about to pass over it. His right front and right rear tyres were completely destroyed in the accident, so it was impossible to examine them and say for certain, but a piece of debris that size could easily have caused a slow puncture. The puncture would have caused the bottoming we saw, and that, in turn, would have caused the rear to step out as it lost grip, since you've unloaded the tyres, meaning that the weight of the car is now being taken on the skids, which have no lateral grip capability. Not only that, but with the car now flat on the deck, the diffuser would be completely stalled, resulting in the rear losing most of its downforce. For me, that offers an explanation as to why the rear suddenly stepped out, and it obviously caught Ayrton by surprise. Still, that brings us to the second question. Why, after the car had stepped out, did it?
Take me to Starbucks.
One option is Starbucks on Ocean Street in Santa Cruz, about a mile to your south, and it gets 2.5 stars on Yelp. Do you want that one?
No.